Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
SoundCartel.
If you've relied on JobKeeper support to keep the business going during these harsh COVID times, you'll already be scrambling to work out how, post-JobKeeper, you're going to pay the bills and keep your doors open. From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. A restructure of your business may be in order, and if that involves redundancies, then you're in for some very difficult conversations ahead. Legal expert Athena Koelmeyer of Workplace Law says she's already been having discussions with her employer clients about how to manage the process properly so that no one falls foul of the law. So Heather Dawson asks, what are the rules around laying off staff to guide employers through this most unenviable of tasks?
Look, it certainly is probably one of the most difficult conversations any employer has to have within an employee population, which is, look, I am very sorry, but I can no longer employ you. And I know that I'm looking you in the eye and saying to you that you don't have a job in a challenging environment for a lot of industries. But there are some rules, particularly for employees who are entitled to access the unfair dismissal jurisdiction. In order to get what's called the genuine redundancy exemption from unfair dismissal, you need to do two things. So you need to consult with your employees about the decision that you're going to make in terms of organisational change, and you need to redeploy them where possible. Obviously, in this environment, we're not necessarily having very many discussions about redeployment, but if you are making people in Team A redundant because you're reducing the number of people in the team or you're absorbing that function elsewhere, and you are advertising for roles in Team B, then you should very carefully consider whether or not your Team A people can be redeployed into Team B, because your job is to try and preserve employment where you can as an employer. Obviously, in this environment, most people are cutting, not expanding. But if there are jobs going, please redeploy wherever possible. That's your obligation under the Fair Work Act to get the genuine redundancy exemption. And I guess the only other thing to mention is when you are looking at selecting people for redundancy from Team A, you must have a fair and reasonable set of criteria for selecting people. If you've got 5 people who all do the same job and you only need 3, then you need to have a fair and reasonable set of criteria that you use to select the people who will be made redundant.
Well, just picking you up on a couple of those points there, Athena, can the process be confused with dismissal in the eyes of an employee who's just been told that they've got to go?
Yes, it certainly can. And that's why that consultation conversation is so critical, because what you want to make sure that you communicate to the employee is that this is due to organisational change. It's not personal, and it's about the position and not the actual person. And that unfortunately, because of the downturn in business, we no longer have enough work for 5, but only for 3, or we simply do not need a position anymore because those duties and functions can be absorbed elsewhere. So it's absolutely key to be completely transparent with your employees about the reason that their employment is coming to an end, and that it is for a proper redundancy reason, not just because you don't like them anymore or because they're terrible at their job or other things that would be actually a termination of a different kind.
So they wouldn't have anywhere to go to argue their case, for example, on seniority or being better at the job than the colleagues who are staying behind. None of that.
Look, we always see some wildly creative applications still for unfair dismissal, because there obviously is no guardian at the gate at the Fair Work Commission telling people they cannot file an application. And then it falls to the employer to say, well, hang on, I've got the genuine redundancy exemption here, so there's a jurisdictional issue that needs to be sorted out before this employee can proceed with an unfair dismissal claim. So people will still file them. They'll feel aggrieved that they have been selected for redundancy and not somebody else. They will think that the world cannot continue to turn without them, and how dare the employer suggest that the business can continue to run without them being in place. So people do get very upset about being selected for redundancy, understandably so. But the employer just needs to make sure that their process has been solid so that they can tell the Fair Work Commission that they are entitled to the genuine redundancy exemption.
Well, even more galling for an exiting employee is being asked to stay on for a transitional period to train up those who are taking over their role, which is pretty galling, really. Is that common? And what can you do to mitigate that sort of thing?
Look, it is. Some employers think that it's a good idea for that to happen. My experience is that that never ends well. Employees, particularly who are feeling aggrieved about the situation, will simply just not turn up for work. They'll go to a doctor, they'll get a sick leave certificate, they just will engage in the big no-show, or if they turn up to work, they're going to be singularly unhelpful. They may pose a risk to your confidential information or other trade secrets. And in my opinion, it's simply not worth it for an employee who you think is going to be resistant to that suggestion. In saying that, there are employees who completely understand what the employer is going through and will happily assist to fulfill that transition on the basis that they enjoyed their time with the employer, they don't want to burn the bridge, you never know when you might get another opportunity to come back, and they will do what the employer would like them to do. There are incentives that employers can offer that might potentially ease the pain a little bit, such as a retention bonus, like if you stay for the duration of your notice period and if you fulfill these obligations and meet these targets, then I'll pay you an extra amount of redundancy pay on exit, and that can sometimes sweeten the pot and show the employer's appreciation for the additional work they've been doing during the notice period in terms of that handover. So there are ways to approach it, but generally speaking, it's a difficult discussion to have. It's difficult to ask an employee to stay. They really just want to move along as best they can most of the time. So if you think there's going to be resistance or the employee is unhappy to help you, I would not suggest trying to compel them. It just doesn't work.
You know, Mazars has been a long-time supporter of SoundCartel, and now they're helping us bring you this podcast. To find out how Mazars can support your business, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.
Would it be fair to say that when an employer is having to cut costs and save money, that the first in line perhaps for termination are the better paid staff, because that's where you're going to make the most savings by losing them?
I think that's fair to say, Heather. Often it's a senior manager where the owner of the business might decide that they have to get their hands dirty again and pick that up themselves, or it's somebody who can be done without because the rest of the team can pick up that slack and can be supervised by somebody else senior in a different area. So the highest paid are often, as you say, the greatest cost savings, and often it's the work of the team that is essential to continue to be done, not necessarily the work of the manager. Like if somebody else can manage that team as well as their own job, or the owner of the business steps back in to manage all of the business and just supervise all of the teams, then the senior employees are often the ones who will lose out. And equally, as you say, galling, it's more difficult for them to get another job because who is recruiting expensive people at the moment? And the answer is almost nobody.
So don't just lob in and say, sorry, mate, you're too expensive.
Look, people will read between the lines and hear that sometimes, Heather, but that's certainly not what should be said. The type of conversation would be, look, I'm very sorry, but we have decided that we can live without your role from a management perspective. Your duties and responsibilities will be redistributed to other employees within the team, or outsourced, or not done at all. And that's why we don't need you moving forward.
What's your advice around giving advance notice of termination and working out the payout?
I think it is a difficult thing, Heather, and the reason that I think that is once you give employees notice, and some employers give months of notice thinking they are being kind, but once you give the employee notice that their employment will end on a date and it will be redundant as at that date, the employee is entitled to leave and you still have to pay the redundancy amount. So while you don't have to pay all of the notice that you gave them if they don't work for it, then you still are stuck with the lump sum of the redundancy that you may not have factored into being required to pay for many months down the track. So giving notice only when you are ready for the employees to actually walk out the door is the proper thing to do.
That was Principal and Managing Director of Workplace Law, Athena Koelmeyer. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.